Welcome back and good afternoon, everyone.
Afternoon.
So we're going to be starting the session on panel discussions, and we've had some interesting presentations and discussions today, and it's great to start wrapping this up workshop with some of the panel experts with experts from various fields. Before we start, can I just check if we have audio from Ibrahim Naim and Hussein Zahir?
I'm here.
Hello.
Zahir.
Yeah,
Okay,
I'm
perfect.
here, Ibrahim.
So we'll go through a quick round of introductions of our panelists, and we'll go through what they think of restoration and rehabilitation of coral reefs and what the purpose of it is in their opinions. And then we'll have a round of directed questions to our panelists. And all attendees, you can feel free to write your questions down in the chat or in the Q&A section if you have any questions, and we'll try and answer them at the end of the discussions. One thing I'd like to request from all of you is that while we know that this topic can be quite controversial and it can also have implications in a number of fields in our country, we ask that all panelists, participants, and the audience keep to the topic and do not distract off from the panel so that we can ensure that there's a interesting conversation on the topic of restoration and rehabilitation going on. So without further ado, let me introduce the panelists. We have Ibrahim Naim, who is the Director General of EPA. We have Hana Amir, our very own marine biologist here at Mmra. And we have finally Hussein Zahir, Director of the Small Island Research Group. So if Ibrahim Naim can give a small introduction about himself and could share with us what he thinks of restoration and rehabilitation of coral reefs and what the purpose of it is. Ibrahim Naim.
Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. Yeah, I think coral reefs are in a very bad situation right now due to various impacts from human impacts as well as the some natural impacts causing all these damages to the reefs. And there's a dire need of coral reef rehabilitation and restoration right now. And I think at the moment, very few people are engaged in real restoration of coral reefs. I see some people doing restoration in the name of restoration, but doing more of a market-based thing for their promotional purposes. That could not be considered as reef rehabilitation and restoration. In some cases, some of these people, what they do is just grab the live coral from very healthy reefs and keeping that in their territory or their area. This, I think, is not actually reef restoration or rehabilitation. Actually, if you are restoring a reef, you should not be destroying another reef to restore your reef. That is what comes into my mind when you talk about the reef restoration in the Maldives, because I see this happening in many places in the Maldives. And this, of course, coral reef rehabilitation and restoration is very important because, as I said previously, the reefs are in very bad condition now. This is due to the prolonged mortality in almost every year due to the elevated sea surface temperatures. And this we have been experiencing last 20 years, I guess, yeah, because of the elevated temperatures. Recruitment of natural coral is very low. And when we surveyed some areas before the 1998 coral bleaching and after that bleaching event, we noticed that a large chunk of shallow water corals have been wiped off and we don't see much of the new corals growing on these areas. So these areas are getting sort of completely devoid of the live corals, and algae are dominating in these areas. So the restoration and rehabilitation in its real form is very important nowadays for countries like Maldives, where the reefs play a very important role in our economy. Thank you.
Thank you, Naimbe. If we can have Hannah sharing her thoughts on restoration, rehabilitation, and what the purposes of it are.
Thanks. I'm sorry, my mic was muted for a second there. I think Naimbe touched on a lot of my thoughts here. As well, when it comes to restoration and rehabilitation, I think within the country, there's a lot of efforts going on among various groups of people. And during this workshop, we've touched on quite a lot of these issues as well. But I think, in my view, restoration and rehabilitation are activities that restore ecological function to a reef, rather than activities that just focus on increasing coral cover or increasing live coral cover to a reef. And these are actions that are sustainable in the long run and improve resilience and resistivity of reefs to both climate change stresses as well as anthropogenic stresses. As Maldivians, we know that climate change is a big issue here, and it has impacted our reefs. The events in 1998 and 2016 with the mass bleaching events are proof of how strong climate change impacts are, as well as how vulnerable our reefs are. But I think it also highlights the importance of coordinated efforts when it comes to these things. So, in my view, restoration and rehabilitation are activities that take into account not just the coral communities, but also everything that lives within a coral reef, all the coral reef fishes, invertebrates, microbial communities, as well as the human factor as well, because we are so dependent on these reefs activities. So yeah, I think that's the purpose of such activities should be to improve and establish ecological functions such that resilience and resistivity of these coral reefs are maintained regardless of whatever stress they may face. Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, Hannah. I think that definitely ties in nicely to some of the questions that we have for the panel later on as well. If we can have Hussein Bey sharing his thoughts on restoration, rehabilitation, and what the purposes of them are. Hussein Bey.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you for Mmra as a host for inviting me onto this thing. I think this workshop is important from a national perspective, especially from coral reef restoration and rehabilitation is a very big subject. If we go back into history, reef rehabilitation and restoration is not a new thing. It started as part of anthropogenic or human-related impacts on reef systems, especially in Asia-Pacific countries, for example, Philippines, Indonesia, and so on and so forth. So they do because of economic needs and then the poor sort of economic nature of the community who depends on natural resources, they use very destructive methods for reef fishing. For example, dynamite fishing, poison fishing, and so on. So basically, physically destroying the reef environment. So that created some sort of international effort for reef restoration, such as artificial reefs or reef structures, maybe steel, concrete, old vehicle tires, and so forth. This provides a habitat for extractive resource people who depends on the extractive resources, and then that becomes a habitat for fish establishment and fish harvesting and so forth. Then on recent times came the climate change impacts on coral reefs, and very significantly bleaching is a major impact on the reef. So there is this natural and anthropogenic impact. So we had in the Indian Ocean perspective, one of the worst hit areas of reefs because of 1998 bleaching. It took like 10 to 15 years for reefs to recover to reef conditions. We are a country sort of, or mainly primarily historically depending on extractive resources. With the introduction of tourism, there comes the non-extractive or aesthetic beauty of the reefs became more important rather than the extractive component. So reef rehabilitation, as Naeem has very much focused or identified, we have so far not done any reef scale rehabilitation or restoration works. Many of the works are initiated or started from the tourism sector as part of their aesthetic value, incremental to the aesthetic value in shallow reef areas. I mean, I have touched this before during the workshop. The thing is, there are no restorations as far as I know on the reef hard structure. Many of these restoration or aesthetic projects are basically based on sandy lagoons on artificial structures of various size, shapes, and material. So that's a very good thing for a certain industry perspective because it provides revenue and other education and awareness aspects of the importance of coral reefs. And when it comes to the during the workshop, it's touched based on a regulation for reef restoration works. I'm a bit, I want to be very careful on, on this subject because for a regulation to come into force, there has to be a serious management concern for these aspects of reef resource uses or reef restoration. One thing that comes to my mind is like people planting trees, shrubs, flowers on pots. Is there a regulation for that? I mean, for me, coral is a plant on a reef. Yeah. Of course, it is very important when we are talking about regulation on the scale of the work that is going on. I don't think anybody would know or even can stop for me to plant a coral on a reef and see what is happening to a coral for that matter. So there's an increase in awareness and self-interest component, which does not do much significant harm unless there is evidence that this is doing significant harm or negative impact on the coral. So on this subject, I mean, I have a lot of thoughts. I'm happy to share as a panelist to the my thoughts based on the questions that are presented here. Thank you.
Thank you, Usembe. I think there can definitely be interesting components of this that we can bring forward. But moving on, I think we can start looking at the directed questions. And throughout the workshop today, one of the questions and thoughts that has come up is about restoring reefs to their natural state. So when it comes to reef restoration and rehabilitation, you always hear people talking about getting things back to how it was, to its natural state. So I guess the question is, and this one is directed to Hannah, can reefs be restored to their natural state? And what do you think of this?
That's a bit of a difficult question to answer, especially I think during these times of when things are shifting around so much, when things are essentially in flux. I think to anyone who has read the IPBES report, you would have seen the statistics. We are looking at, I think it was 70 to 90% loss. If it's a 1.5%, 1.5 degree change, and close to 99% loss in what coral reefs are if we go beyond 2 degrees of temperature increases across the world. And related to that, we are seeing more and more impacts of climate change, with changes in weather patterns, with changes in circulation patterns, both in the atmosphere and within the oceans as well. So what the oceanscape is very different from what it used to be. We all know that sea surface temperatures are higher than what it used to be 20 years ago. We know that ocean acidification, ocean pH is higher than what it used to be 20 years ago. So what's natural now is not what was natural then. So I do not personally believe it's possible to restore something to their natural state, because we do not know what exactly natural, so to speak, is. We do not exactly know what normal is. Where baselines have been made, we can sort of aim to reach similar coral reef diversities and coral benthic cover percentages similar to that. But we also we also do that with understanding that based on the frequency and magnitude of change, we might not be able to reach it. So I think this got brought up in the workshop discussions as well. I do not, with all the restoration and rehabilitation activities that we do, and with all the intentions we have, we won't be able to restore anything to their natural state. We will be able to restore something to a state where they adapt to whatever changes they're able to face in the future, if that makes sense.
Thank you, Hannah. I guess in a way, the natural state is changing a lot with the shifting baselines as well. So we have the second question. The second question is directed to Naimbe, and the question is about whether. So we know that our coral reefs around the world are threatened, and part of what makes this threat so dangerous is the degradation. And corals can degrade due to a number of reasons that are not limited to anthropogenic regions and effects on climate change. How would you identify, quantify, and address any stressors that drove the degradation or change of the reef before acting with an intervention?
Yeah, thank you. I think we have been talking here about the various impacts. Echo. Hello?
Yeah, we can.
I'm hearing an echo. Is it okay now?
Yeah. It's all right now.
Yeah. We have been talking here about the various impacts that are creating destruction to the reefs. Some are anthropogenic, some are human-made, and some are natural. And when you consider the Maldivian reefs, I think we are facing huge impacts due to the reclamation and dredging, as well as there are so many structures that we make over the reef, over water structures, so common right now in the Maldives. And these are some factors that impact our coral reefs and the coral cover. And when these activities are being carried out, we see the live coral cover goes down significantly in many of these reefs. And but as you know, we are living on an island nation where the whole thing is made up of corals. And if we are to continue with the development that we need, definitely we will be doing these type of activities like dredging, reclamation, and making structures over the reef. These are detrimental to the reef, yes, we know, but when it comes to the restoration, we definitely have to think on where to do these restorations. For example, if you do restoration on a reef that earmarked for reclamation, that may probably become useless. And with regard to the question you have put on me, I think there are so many threatening processes which are on coral reefs. We have to address first the threatening processes before we continue with any restoration works. Otherwise, the restoration becomes useless. And some of these threatening processes are beyond our control, as we have been talking about, like the excessive elevated temperatures almost, which is experienced every year during the hot months. And those factors, to deal with those factors, we need to look for corals that are more tolerant to the heat. And I think slowly these type of options are being available, and several research are being done in many parts of the world to look for more stronger corals that can survive excessive temperatures and excessive sedimentation. So I think we have a promising future in terms of reef restoration and reef rehabilitation if we do it the way that has to be done. Not to mention that what we are doing right now needs to be more. I think we have to change the way that we do reef restoration in the Maldives right now, because we need to consider the holistic approach when it comes to the reef, not only increasing the live coral cover of a monospecific species. That is not actually reef restoration or reef rehabilitation. We need to think of the ecosystem services and the functions of the ecosystem. And also we have to look for, as I said before, more resilient and more heat tolerant and more robust types of corals in terms of increasing the success of restoration. If we want to improve the success of the restoration, we have to look for these things, I think. Thank you.
Thank you, Naimbe. I think we certainly agree with a lot of what you've said. The next question we have is directed towards Hannah and Naima again. So the question goes, there are a number of different types of interventions, passive or active interventions, and passive strategies deal closely with management that protects and promotes natural recovery and ecological functions, and active strategies deal closely with direct action that aim to artificially speed up recovery. And so which of these options do you think is more effective in the long term within the Maldivian contexts? And I think we can extend from your answer from the last one. So maybe if Hannah can go answering first, and then we can give Naim back.
Yeah, I think building up from what Naimbe was saying, before we sort of do any sort of active or passive restoration, there's a need to assess the state of the reefs and remove any sort of thing that's doing the damage to the reef. I think because passive strategies are so closely related to management regimes, there's a need to identify places where there's more resistivity of reefs as well as more resilience, identify where there are more heat resistive corals, and ensure that these places are places that are protected and have an effective management regime. So my thought is that when it comes to what we should doing in terms of active passive restoration, or is we should be strengthening our passive restoration methods, because if those measures aren't effective, if they aren't in place, and if they fall apart, none of the active methods of intervention will actually work, because those stresses will keep coming back and the reef will keep getting degraded. So there's a sort of hierarchy, I think. Establish the proper passive methods of restoration, make them effective, identify the places where they should be prioritized at, because as we all know, funding is limited, human resources is limited, time is limited, the capability for us to go from one place to another is limited. So with all these limitations, identify the key places, put these passive methods into place, make sure they're effective, and then assess where we should be intervening in terms of active restoration methods. So a combination of passive and then identifying where passive and active restoration actions should be taking place. So that it is more effective in the long run. Active methods, I think, in this country so far has been, like both of Sembe and Naimbe have brought up, short-term projects that aren't actual restoration or rehabilitation efforts. And if they are to transform into something that is actual efforts and that does remain effective in a long-term period, we do need both these measures to we need a combination, a hierarchical combination of these measures to be effective. Thanks.
Thanks, Hannah. Naimbe, what do you think about? Do you have anything to add? I know it was very similar to the last question, but if you have any additional parts to add.
Yeah, I also agree with Hannah, and we need both passive as well as active interventions with regard to restoration and rehabilitation. The passive in terms of when you think passive, we should always remove the factors that are causing environmental and reef degradation. Like if the reefs are left there to survive as it is without much of the human activities, there is no need of actually active interventions. So the best thing is to preserve the reef and protect, keep the reefs as it is, because there are natural selections going on. When you think of ecological time scale, there's as well as there is this shift of habitats and trophic structures shifting in reefs. So the passive will be very useful. At the same time, we have to note that some of the reefs are being destroyed because of our human activities, as well as sometimes due to the natural causes. In those cases, I think active intervention is essential, or active intervention is needed. Thank you.
Thank you. I guess that now brings us to the question of when should these interventions be presented? And the other question then is to so the first part of the question is when, and the second part is, since the coral reefs are such an interconnected dynamic system within an even larger interconnected dynamic system, considering the changes in climate, when should restoration measures be implemented in a reef? So in context of climate change. And this question is directed to Hussein Zahir.
Thank you. That's a big question. When, I don't know when. Yeah, but in the context of Hannah and Nine's discussion or answers to the questions, I think when is a relative time frame? Yeah, I mentioned that active intervention was not required for a like 10 to 15-year period. I mean, the 1998 bleach in recovery took that amount of time to a reasonable from the baseline we had at that time while I was working in MRC. The thing is, when becomes very important when these recurrent bleaching events occur. We had, after 1998, we had a 2010 minor event, and then there was this 2015-16 major event. So we are talking about like a decadal time frame for these recurring climate change events. So all the recovery, or most of the recovery from 1998 was decimated because of 2016. So the natural resilience or the growth factor was compromised because of the having said that there's still a lot of resilient corals. And it is very important to tie it with the development aspects of these coral reef areas, because we have very expensive tourist resorts, for example, just to give you an example. And then it's a very good business property. Yeah? But there are human interventions that actually unknowingly compromise these long-term natural recovery aspects or resilience of the reefs. One example is beach nourishment. In addition to the development aspect damages. So beach nourishment creates sedimentation, which is quite continuous onto the reef. And that is a negative factor that compromises the natural resilience. So if these things are sort of doing negative impact to the reef, the other one is the water quality example, because in the resorts, there is a good regulation that secondary level treatment plants should be used as a mechanism to treat the water before it disposes to the marine environment. But both of these, knowing that they may have negative impacts, there's no mechanism to monitor the subsequent effects of these effluents or impacts on the reef systems, even though there are regulatory measures. So it's very important for management to have access to this data or availability of this data to see the effectiveness of the management, even, for example, to improve the disposed water quality or to regulate this beach nourishment, because if it is done frequently on every month basis, then it's a chronic effect that damages the reef system. So if these factors are there, then perhaps, compounded by all these effects, there is no recovery on the reef from a natural aspects, then it's a good point to start some sort of human intervention to initiate some sort of recovery, for example, restoration. But even to do that, you need to do some kind of baseline assessment. What is the reason that the reefs are not recovering? I have given you two examples. Maybe there's too much rubble because of the previous bleaching or other impacts. So is there a requirement to remove these rubble structures or other negative factors to do this restoration works? Restoration works actually doesn't work if you go and dump some coral larvae or fragments there. It doesn't work because natural systems work somewhat differently, because if I can give you an example of, for example, biologically aided restoration, for example, provide some fertile gametes or larvae to the reef system. Even if you put millions of larvae, you would know eventually after 3 years that these larvae will settle and thrive to a very good reef system. So there are very many environmental variables that need to be understood before that kind of restoration work. So the time frame, I don't know, but you have to understand the system, whether there is such a requirement is necessary. I hope that answers your question to some extent.
Hannah, would you have anything to add to the question?
I think Hussein, we covered a lot of uh, what can be said to that question. The question of when, I think, is one lead scientist across the world also grapples with: when should we intervene in a reef? When should we be acting on these measures that we have decided to act on? Like Osembe has said, I think an important factor that plays into it is having a baseline, understanding what the state of the reefs were at a particular point of time, be it in terms of just coral color, or be it in terms of diversity, in terms of what the settlement and recruitment rates of that reef are, be it in terms of how the management measures that have been implemented on that reef have changed, or even be it in terms of whether the stresses that are being implemented on a reef has changed over time. Because particularly with development projects, reefs that used to be pristine, if that's an appropriate word to use, pristine sort of reefs that did not necessarily have much anthropogenic pressure. And I say much because I don't I don't think there's any reef in any part of the world that's not been touched by human impact. So reefs that have not been impacted by much anthropogenic pressure are now under a lot more than what they used to be. So it's difficult to say when a measure should be implemented. And one thing we can look to is change, and that requires effective and continuous monitoring of reefs across this country, I think, to see when and where those detrimental changes are happening. And if we can identify the when and where these detrimental changes are happening, and then combine it with why these detrimental changes are happening, if we know that they are due to a specific sort of pressure that we can control, we can then, as a management, as a restoration or perhaps rehabilitation measure, control that measure. So I suppose my answer for when is when we identify these detrimental pressures.
Thanks, Hannah. So the next question is actually something that we've sort of been mulling over throughout the workshop. So when it comes to success within restoration and rehabilitation, what does success really mean when it comes to restoration and rehabilitation? So there's lots of different efforts across the country, and there's lots of enthusiasm from different people coming up now. And when you consider all of this, what length of time would be needed to essentially say that a restoration project or rehabilitation project is successful? Realistically, how long do you think? This question is directed at Husenbe.
Can you repeat the question? I was away for an important conversation.
So the question was, when we talk about success within restoration and rehabilitation, there's quite a lot of different efforts all over the country at the moment, and there's definitely growing enthusiasm for this. Could you share with us what you think of the success in this sense, and what length of time would you say is needed to give a sort of realistic answer to this question?
I think this was a lot touch base during the workshop. I mean, success, how can we know success if there is no feedback? I mean, Naimbe could answer this question much more easily, because I also do environmental studies, and then I have also contributed a lot of environmental management plans for reef restoration. I mean, there's just a terminology, but these are not reef restoration, rehabilitation. But mostly these are sort of reef fragmentation or reef fragment growing techniques for various methods and so on and so forth. And when these fragments are grown, it is either transplanted to the natural reef system or artificial structures and so on and so forth. And that success story can only be shared or reviewed based on the feedback of these restoration works. As far as I know, I can't answer for EPA, but as far as I know, there is like more than 80% no response in terms of monitoring of the systems or monitoring data feedback to the regulator of the work they are doing. And so we, as far as I know, as someone who is in this field, I don't know how successful these projects are. Some are obviously very successful. I mean, they boast in their websites and so on and so forth. But data is very important for managers to review the system. So based on that review information, I think it leads to some direction to MRC or Mmra to develop some guidelines or show direction to, okay, this method is much more successful than that method for the restoration or fragment growth work and so on and so forth. And having that being said, there are several sorts of designs for reef restoration works, but I strongly emphasize on the concept of reef restoration. What we do are not reef restorations, but reef scaping in lagoonal areas or some areas that are devoid of coral. So time frame, again, as I mentioned, is very difficult, but this information is much more important rather than talking about a time frame on the aspects of coral reef restoration. But often the success story is very superficial or visual. I mean, when you go and take some, for example, from projects when these are relocated to certain areas, just to give you an example, in the first few days it looks very nice, but there is no information on how much of the survivorship of certain species, how much are dying, how much are growing, and so on and so forth. So very little information on the aspects of coral diversity that are being transplanted, what species are growing, what species are doing. So these information becomes very important for rehabilitation works, especially when we talk about the resilience of reefs. It's only because of this natural and artificial stresses, the very resilient coral tend to survive. So if we can understand the species that are more resilient, then this becomes important as part of, again, aesthetics of the reef, but then the aspects of reef ecology, biodiversity, and then interaction between different species are also very important in terms of genetic diversity, which is much more important in terms of maintaining the reef for a longer run.
Naimbe, would you have anything to add to this question?
Thank you. I think success is a very relative term, as well as the length, how long you have to carry out a restoration work. Those are very relative things. For some people, success is just depending on the success just means the increase in the color of the coral. For example, we have seen that on some of these sandy lagoons, they plant acropora or branching corals on poles and take a picture and just show, and they may claim that they are very successful in making or in restoring a reef. But when you first go and see that particular location, that you don't find any live coral there at the beginning. So why do you want to grow live coral on a sandy reef flat where naturally live corals cannot grow? But if you put the poles and, or if you have a structure there, and you may be able to grow some corals. So the success in terms of coral restoration, I think we have to have first the baseline to compare with how successful you are, the baseline. And it is very important that not only to grow one specific type of coral species, but if you want to restore and rehabilitate a degraded reef, first thing is that you should at least have some baseline to compare. Otherwise, you won't be able to determine your success. Then the next thing is the length, how long or how many days or months you have to, or years you have to do the restoration work. That also depends on the types of corals that you intend to grow or rehabilitate. As all you know, the acropora or the branching corals grow very fast, while the massive ones grow very slow. So these questions are very relative, and so many factors are there to consider when you determine the success of a rehabilitation program and its length. Thank you.
Thank you. This brings us to our next question, which is focused on the people of the nation. So when you consider the Maldives, we know that it's spread over wide geographical distance, and it can be harder for people, for at least a group of people, to go from one place to the other, monitoring and conducting surveys. So in this sense, there is potential for the community to help out, and it's quite an important role as well for the community to help out and help as much as they can in the restoration and rehabilitation activities. So would you agree that the community members can engage in effective coral rehabilitation and restoration? And how would you say would be best for the community engagement in this sense? And if so, are these activities active or passive? And this one is directed towards Husenbe.
Yeah, I'm here. Well, community participation anywhere in the world is very important to sort of to establish the ownership of the ecosystems that they depend on. I mean, it's not different for the Maldives even, but it is it becomes quite challenging depending on what type of work you do. But there are I have been involved in similar projects, for example, World Bank projects doing exactly the same thing. But it's very costly in the Maldives, I mean, to do this kind of engaging community. There are a lot of community, for example, school environmental clubs that are keen to do this kind of work. I mean, we need to create awareness among the young minds how important the coral itself and coral reefs are. I mean, nobody can deny that we depend on the goods and services that are provided by the coral reefs, whether it is food, aesthetic, or coastal defense. So the importance of coral is that big grows from a single polyp and over several hundred years grows to large structures. This kind of understanding to the mindset of the young people is very important. So small scale projects, we are talking about adaptation. I mean, climate change adaptation and mitigations are one of the important components of sort of enabling or understanding the local communities to have an understanding of the impacts of climate change to these resources. So in that context, small scale awareness adaptation projects can be driven through appropriate financing mechanisms to the school. Example, school environmental clubs. We can take the school children to the reefs on a snorkeling tours and show them this is a bad reef, this is a good reef, you can grow this and that and this. So that's the very baseline, basic foundation of this kind of work as far as I can understand. And I'm quite cautious in terms of this restoration to a nation level effort. For me, based on the understanding and the level of we are currently focusing on, it would do more damage to the natural systems than benefits. Obviously, there are environmental awareness benefits, but then again, a nationwide similar project can have lot of benefits to certain people. I mean, this is all to do with money. Yeah. If there's enough money, in the workshop, there was an example of like um, Australian efforts of large coral spawning slicks being collected by oil booms and then coming onto a reef and dumping it onto the reef systems, hoping that they will grow. But even to start that, we don't have the famous Australian or Great Barrier Reef like mass spawn and synchrony in the equatorial region anywhere in the world. Maldives do not have that kind of mass synchrony to collect larvae from the wild and then grow and sort of rehabilitate the reefs from that biologically induced perspective. But the fragmentation work, as Naimbe is fearful, I'm also very fearful in terms of how much of an effort that can be done, even at a citizen science level. There's no way of controlling or managing whether the fragments are coming from a very nice reef and then growing it on a lagoonal area is, for me, I mean, personally, it's not reef restoration. It's coral gardening for a different purpose, not for ecological or the very goods and services I talked about before. The natural resources like food, aesthetics. Aesthetics is there, but this doesn't provide food. It doesn't provide coastal defense, effective coastal defense from these kind of structures. To do that, it has to be done at a massive scale, which is the dollar or rupiah number is astronomical. I mean, it's very high. I mean, to restore 1 hectare, which is 100 by 100-meter reef, if you read any of the literature around, it's like close to $1 million for restoration works, even to begin restoration works. We don't talk about the success or failure of that investment.
Thank you, Zembe. So with the expected climate change degradation that we are very likely to be experiencing even to a bigger extent in the coming years, more so than we are now. This then leads us to the question of increasing the frequency and magnetic, this leads us to the question of different methods, new novel methods that can be included, methods such as genetic modification, larval reseeding, among others. When should these be field tested, and should these be started? And this question is for Hannah.
Yeah, you're very right that restoration and rehabilitation is an evolving field of research and one that's, despite its age, that is starting to take there's a lot of research going on in it right now, and there's quite a lot of money being funneled into restoration and rehabilitation techniques of various types across the world. And this does mean that there's novel sorts of methods, things that have been previously not been attempted before, or we weren't able to attempt before because the technology wasn't there, being attempted now. Some of the genetic modification stuff that's going on over in the US is one of those things. And it's being, from my understanding, was being piloted for a very long time. And a lot of it is still lab tests to see if what they want to do works, which is to create more heat resistant corals. I hesitate to sort of lean on these very novel methods, as well as in addition to the older sort of established methods. Hosembe and Naimbe have both gotten into for the reasons they have mentioned with these new novel methods. Because they are so novel, they are also very expensive methods, and I question whether they are methods which will be sustainable in the long run. Simba mentioned how expensive restoration rehabilitation is right now, and if we are looking into genetic modification of uh, coral species and then taking them out into the field, um, that's going to be a pretty expensive process, and one that I don't think most nations will be able to entertain for a long time if they don't adapt to the natural systems. And speaking of the natural systems, this might be the this might be in a similar line of thinking as when they started genetically modifying food, but I question whether it's the best practice to do so when they would be competing with wild corals who may be better, who may just have better survivability, unlike these genetically modified or types of corals that may get introduced. With this specific type of development, the other thing that makes me feel like it should not be field tested at all, especially in the Maldives where we are so reliant on reefs. And if we were to lose the reefs, we would be losing pretty much all of our national income because both fisheries and tourism are both so reliant on it. Is the same issues they face with crops, in that sometimes these species can evolve in such a way they become more susceptible to stresses like diseases or other things like that, and could even promote a monoculture of genera or species. So this loss of natural genetic diversity. I don't think the world is at a place where we should be testing any sort of genetic modification type of novel methods for these reasons. Larval methods, there's a bit more research, a bit more, I think, success related to it, though the definition of success is debatable, but success in the sense that the genetic modification type of methods is what I think is something we are not ready for. With the larval methods, we might not be ready for in terms of financial limitations, but I think there's a bit more realistic methods there.
Thank you, Hannah. I think your answer ties in nicely with my next question. You highlighted the benefits of coral reefs to Maldivians in terms of fisheries and tourism. Another key feature of coral reefs to the Maldivians is the coastal protection they offer. So the next question, which is for Naimbe, is whether coral reef restoration can increase the coastal protection that's offered.
Thank you. Yeah, I have a very short answer for that. If the reefs are in good condition and reefs are healthy, I think we don't need these artificial structures for our coastal protection. So whether the reef is a restored reef or a natural reef, if there's a good reef where the waves can break, I don't think we need any more coastal protection, artificial coastal protection. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So the next question is that despite the numerous coral reef restoration and rehabilitation efforts in the country, it's not done with purpose of restoring or rehabilitating reefs, but there's value of these activities that seem to be more capitalistic or marketing oriented than attempting to improve the health of the reefs or ecological diversity. Do you think, would you agree that this is true? I think to some extent you've answered this question within the other questions that you've answered, but this one is directed towards Naimbe and Husembe. And yeah.
Yeah, I think it's very true.
Well, Naimbe, that's a very short answer, I guess. Yeah. Nothing more to add. Well, everybody, I think, agrees that. Can I go ahead? Can you hear me?
Go ahead, please.
Everybody agrees to the fact that predominant proportion of these reefs are in the sense associated with market-oriented or market. I wouldn't say exclusively market. There are people who are passionate about this and some conservation and understanding of what is happening to the coral restored or replanted are there, but the thing is, it's not appropriately shared among the people, or we are not aware of that it's been shared to the international or wider community. Yeah. So there are, even though it is market oriented, there are benefits. I know that some projects are involved in doing this. For example, adopting a coral fragment. I mean, it's very high-end resorts or places that, I mean, there are very rich people coming and our children can adopt a coral, and then they have these programs sending photographs of these corals and then provide sort of a timeline series of what is happening to the coral or the coral fragment. This is all good and very nice, but it should also be focused to the local community as well. I mean, it's mostly the foreigners or non-Maldivians who are able to pay for this adaptation and do these kind of things, which is a global awareness program of the environmental conservation efforts in the Maldives. But this should be translated or somewhat sponsored to the local community as well. I mean, it can only be done through sponsorship of, for example, certain resorts. Maybe a school club can adapt a reef area and see what is happening to the reef area. So they are aware of these kind of conservation, restoration of efforts that are going throughout the Maldives. I mean, obviously it would look nice if they are happy, if their corals are growing nicely and so on and so forth. So it's a good thing to go ahead, but there are also some negative aspects of that. I mean, especially based on a market or capitalistic approach to these kind of things.
Thank you, Husembe. I think we can now move on to some of the questions directed by the audience. So the first question we have here, just a moment.
Awas kollamanado.
So we have a question for Naimbe. Why is EPA being a regulatory body not taking active intervention to protect reefs from damage due to reclamation and degradation? And why are these projects not stopped or checked to ensure proper restoration work is carried out or monitoring report of these works are submitted?
It's a very difficult question to answer. You know, so many development activities are going on at rocket speed here. And as the people who are here, the EPA and the people working in MMRI, we have a very passionate, we are very passionate in protecting the reef, but that's not the case for all the people. And yes, I understand that we are regulatory body, but how much regulatory powers we have is still debatable. And we have the ministries and the ministers and the parliament members who are making policies and who are deciding on which project to go ahead and which not to go ahead, regardless of the environmental consequences. That is the reality. So what the EPA is doing is trying to minimize or trying to propose, we are proposing the ways to minimize and mitigate the environmental impacts. We definitely know that all of these development projects, especially large projects, have environmental impacts. But we on always we provide suggestions and we provide we give advice to the consultant and the developer on how to minimize and mitigate impacts. We are not here to stop the government projects. Actually, we just provide ways to minimize the impacts. Does that answer the question? Zembe.
Thank you, Naimbe. We have a question for Hana. Is there any work done by MMRI apart from ecological surveys of coral reefs to ensure successful restoration of reefs? Understanding the biology and physiology of species of corals are important, and methods of larval restoration, larval rearing are also crucial.
Thanks, Suru. So we're starting to build up a series of studies that do answer those questions. When the National Restoration and Rehabilitation Program came into effect in 2019, one thing we did was assess the type of factors and features and things like that we needed to better understand to actually start restoring and rehabilitating a reef instead of continuing on with what we have been doing, which both Usembe and Naimbe has both mentioned is more like landscaping. So some of the things we are doing is to see what kind of methods that we could potentially introduce here is the assessment of when and where corals are spawning across the nation. So this specific study is done through reports from the community. And it's to see, while we have general ideas of when and where corals may spawn. So we know around March, April, May, that's one period where we start to see spawning across various reefs. We want to sort of increase the precision and accuracy of the sort of what we know. So that's one study we are doing, trying to see if trying to understand what periods coral reefs spawn and whether they do form coral slicks. To support that, we're also aiming to begin a study that specifically identifies coral colonies and identify exactly when they spawn. So better understanding of these spawning patterns. To supplement that, we are also looking into settlement. We are currently conducting settlement and recruitment studies, piloting that in a couple of Maldives atoll sites and expanding out into some of the other atolls with some people who have agreed to deploy settlement plates for us, to see what the settlement and recruitment rates are. And these are important things when we start to think about the long-term sustainability of restoration and rehabilitation, as well as the capacity of a reef to recover. So those are two types of studies that we are currently conducting, but there are a couple more studies that are in the pipeline, and we are seeing if they can be done to support these sort of efforts. I hope that answers that question.
So there's a question to Husembe. How much of an effective tool is coral restoration and, sorry.
Sembe?
Yeah, is that the question? Okay, how much? I thought this is an incomplete question. How much of an effort is coral restoration? Is that the question?
How effective of a tool is coral restoration and rehabilitation to track the impacts of anthropogenic and natural stresses? Does that make sense?
Well, the
That's
question
very
doesn't make any sense to me. I mean,
let me repeat. So how effective of a tool is coral restoration and rehabilitation in tackling the anthropogenic and natural stresses that are coming up?
restoration of anthropogenic impact, obviously it's a useful tool, but actually, as I mentioned earlier, the impact of anthropogenic impact should first be understood. That's very important. So it is with that understanding that any restoration works could be continued. Whether the compounded effects of anthropogenic effects are affecting the reefs, then we know we should try to understand what it is, whether the reclamation works or beach nourishment is chronically adding sediments on the substrate. So if the area is chronically smothered or the reef substrate is with these sediments, and it hinders the natural settlement and recruitment or visible recruitment you may see about 2 to 3 years after. So for those areas, active restoration could be added hand or help to revive the reef from the baseline or the state where it is trying to come over with. So those areas could be very useful for that kind. As I mentioned, these kind of factors need to be, whether it is water quality, whether it is sedimentation or other effects that are negatively impacting this natural recovery. So those areas I can very confidently or positively say that those areas may need or would need a helping hand in terms of recovery of those areas. So those kind of tools would be helpful, yeah.
Thank you. We now have a question for Naimbe. While Hannah is mentioning funding is limited, could you please answer a question about green techs? If it's used, what are the focuses of funding and why isn't it available for public knowledge?
That's a very difficult question for me to answer, that question regarding the green fund and how it is spent, because I'm not in a position to answer that question. We for EPA, definitely we didn't get any funds from green fund. And we didn't get anything from green fund yet, but we are hoping that we will also get some from the green fund. I don't know whether MMRI has got anything from the green fund. Thank you.
As far as we know, the green tax is handled by the finance ministry and the environment ministry, so it's really up to them. They would be the one to direct those.
I can help.
Yes, please.
Since those are two national institutions and they have a very, I think frankly said what the situation is. I have also been from a private sector perspective, how to tap into this fund. As far as I know, this fund is administered by the finance ministry, chaired by environment minister. There's a committee. I mean, in terms of good governance, this is a very big thing I'm trying to say. I mean, there is currently no allocation or consideration to fund or finance private sector projects through green fund. These are mostly TSIP funds are being financed by this fund. So it's a shame. So hopefully this will somewhat create a sort of some kind of awareness for people to consider this, because we are collecting like over $60 million per year from green funds. And I believe that some proportion of that money could be spent. And that said, I mean, I unofficially know we can propose projects through proper avenues to consider for funding through this green fund. So there is at least a green signal that it may be enabled.
Yeah, there is green signal, and still the funds are being at the moment spent on activities such as building of these waste management facilities and construction of water and sewerage networks, which are in turn useful for the public, as well as this in the long run will help prevent environmental degradation. As you know, the waste is a very big issue in all of our islands, and a lot of waste are being dumped into the sea. And if we can have good and proper waste management centers, that will definitely increase that will help us to increase the health of the reef. So I would say that the green fund, the money from the green fund is spent on activities that are linked to the environmental protection. But for the conservation and restoration of reefs, at the moment, I don't see any money spent from the green fund. Thank you. Hello?
So because we're running out of time, there's just time for one small question, and I'd appreciate it if it would be answered with time in mind. To what degree can there be a universal method? And this can be, yeah, if each of you can answer this question. So to what degree can there be a universal method in restoration methods and guidelines?
I don't think there is a universal method that can be applied. I have right now in front of me a Reef Rehabilitation Manual, which is compiled by Jeff Coral, United Nations Global Environmental Facility Coral Reef Rehabilitation Manual. It talks about several methods that are currently being practiced throughout the world. So this was published in 2010. 10 years on, I know there are many methods, but basically it's physical restoration and biological restoration. So it's, as far as to my mind, there is not a universal single method. There are several methods that can be used, and then the success of different methods vary. But these methods actually are tied to their simplicity and complexities as well. So this is tied to the cost of the methodologies. So for poor people, there are cheaper methods. For rich people like Australians, Americans, they have very expensive methods to do that. So there's no specific answer I can give based on my knowledge to a very simple method.
Naimbe, would you like to have a go at this question?
Yeah, I would say one size does not fit all. Thank you very much.
Hannah?
Yeah, I think the same way Naimbe put it pretty succinctly. I don't think there'll be a universal method, especially for a place like the Maldives where we're so spatially spread out. I think quite a lot of this will be perhaps a amalgamation of various methods, seeing what works in various reefs if we do implement them. I don't think a single specific method will work in any reef here.
Thank you, Hannah. And a very big thank you to Husenbe, Naimbe, and also to Hannah. This has definitely been very interesting, and I'm sorry for not being able to get all the questions that the audience had asked to the panelists, but we'll try and answer these questions via email or through the chat. And hopefully you guys enjoyed as much as we did as well. This conversation is probably going to be continuing quite a lot during the next coming months and the years, and we'll try and make sure to keep doing as much as we can to keep it ongoing. So once again, thank you to the panel and thank you to the audience as well. And we'll wrap up the panel discussions for now, but Hannah is going to be giving some closing remarks soon.